Hello. For our structures project, we chose to research the collapse of the Ann Street parking garage in New York. Our group is myself, Cayden Brown, Hope Lacy, Solana Hendrickson, and Rogelio Monter. During this presentation, we will take a look at some of the key information, the design and construction of the project, the actual failure, and the root cause behind the collapse. We will also look at a comparative case before diving into accountability, who was responsible, and what we learned from the accident.
So what is the project? It is a 3.7 million project completed in 1925. The contractors and designers are unknown, but what is known is that it's built for the 57 Ann Street Realty Associates in Manhattan, New York. The owners being Alan Hennick and the co-owner being Jeffrey Hennick. The design approach that was made for this collapse was a flat slab floor, where it was a cinder block concrete slab reinforced with welded wire fabric made up of the flooring. There's steel framing, where the primary structure was a steel beam and a girder frame. It was also a concrete exterior. All steel members were encased in concrete. It was a mixed structure. In addition to the steel and concrete members, unreinforced masonry was used for vertical support, resulting in an unusual hybrid system. The construction began with the assemblage of the steel beam and girder frame. The concrete was then poured around the steel. The floors were poured onto wire fabric mesh. Lastly, brick and masonry supports were added to reinforce the garage. The design margins were very slim, so additions were added over the years as required.
Disaster we saw in 2021 that the New York City Department of Buildings completed an inspection report, found there were no major red flags in the building's structural integrity nor functionality. But then in March, reports were flowing in regards to a fear of structural damage. Workers noticed a large amount of cracks and damage to the higher levels. They started trying to deal with this in April, but then they began incorrectly removing bricks from a support without the correct permits or documents. And then the disaster unfortunately occurred on April 18, 2022, when a worker drove over the weakened support. The failure occurred at 4 a.m. on April 18, 2022, when the Ann Street parking garage ultimately collapsed. The cave-in started on the upper floors and started cascading downwards. It killed the garage's general manager and injured several construction workers almost instantly. Investigations immediately began as to how the catastrophe could have ever occurred. Post-disaster, we saw on April 18th, first responders began working diligently on extracting people from the collapse without causing greater harm to the structure. But on April 19th, just a day later, investigations immediately began to determine the cause of the failure. And in May, we saw some public lobbying and outcry. It led to reform checked and inspection of all major New York City parking garages for similar structural problems. And then in June, the parking garage was ultimately fully demolished. All of the neighboring businesses are still processing the damage to the community. One of the immediate problems with the structure is that a load-bearing masonry pier failed when it started to collapse. There was a weakened or sometimes even non-existent shoring in the garage, and there were unregulated loads caused by a car driving where it wasn't supposed to. Some of the underlying problems was the identification of a load-bearing pier as non-load-bearing in some of the drawings. Several repairs were incorrect or unsafe over the years, and there was just general poor quality control. And then some of the greater systemic problems were that the owner wanted to keep the garage open at minimal cost, and that some of the building codes were not reinforced and were sometimes just ignored altogether.
The collapse of the Champlain Towers South, a condominium in Florida, has several similarities to the Ann Street garage disaster. In both cases, the structures had existing flaws that reduced safety margins, so later stressors or alterations triggered a collapse. Deterioration was not a surprise. These were already known issues. Both events illustrate how inspection or warning by itself is not enough. Effective remediation, adequate funding, planning, and compliance are all essential to maintain structural safety. Determining responsibility in the Ann Street collapse requires looking at each party's role and examining how their actions or inactions directly contributed to an environment in which unsafe conditions went unrecognized, unreported, and unaddressed. These parties include management and ownership of the garage, the engineering firm in charge of repairs, the original designers and builders of the garage, and the inspectors and overall system. All of these parties bore responsibility to maintain the garage in a safe and usable way, and in many ways there was a disregard for these responsibilities. In general, engineers and managers of public spaces should strive to learn from these mistakes and practice in a responsible, ethical way, not always the quickest or easiest route.
One lesson learned was to never assume structural elements are non-load bearing. One of the most critical lessons from the parking garage collapse is that structural assumptions can be fatal. The masonry pier that employees removed was incorrectly believed to be a simple encasement rather than a load-bearing component. This misinterpretation happened because the garage relied on outdated drawings, incomplete assessments, and informal visual judgments instead of rigorous engineering investigation. Another lesson learned was that deferred maintenance and aging infrastructure require proactive structural management. The Ann Street garage was nearly 100 years old at the time of its collapse. Over decades, concrete deterioration, corrosion, water infiltration, and increased vehicle weights had weakened the system. Internal reports and previous inspections had noted issues such as cracking and overstressed slabs, yet repairs were superficial rather than comprehensive. The third lesson learned was that unsafe work practices must be immediately identified and stopped. The brick removal that triggered the collapse was done without permits, without engineered shoring, and without trained supervision. This failure highlights that construction management must ensure communication between inspectors, engineers, and workers so no assumptions are made in isolation. When unsafe work practices go unchallenged, failures are not accidental, they are inevitable. Some recommendations include strengthening structural inspection requirements for older buildings, improving codes for repairs, alterations, and temporary work, implementing digital tools to enhance structural safety, enhancing training and safety culture for workers and owners, and strengthening third-party review and independent oversight.
In conclusion, the collapse at 57 Ann Street was not caused by a single mistake, but by a series of preventable failures: misidentification of structural elements, decades of deferred maintenance, unsafe work practices, and insufficient regulatory oversight. By implementing stronger inspection frameworks, modernizing codes, integrating digital technologies, and reinforcing safety culture, the engineering and construction industries can significantly reduce the risk of similar disasters. Ultimately, safeguarding the public requires a comprehensive commitment to diligence, technical rigor, and ethical responsibility at every stage of structural design, inspection, and maintenance. This is our Works Cited page. Thank you for listening to our presentation.